In an article from The Atlantic, a writer argues that the U.S. is similarly tracking, in some ways, like the fall of ancient Rome. He goes on to say that for years he has predicted something like a civil war will happen in the U.S. Trumpists will win in the short term. They will win the day, but over time will eventually lose power. That is to say, in The Atlantic magazine, a mainstream media publication, a writer is arguing a civil war is coming and Trump supporters will win. Now, if you want to argue at some point they lose power, sure. No one retains power indefinitely, but it is a bold statement coming from a mainstream publication. Recently, I appeared on the Russell Brand podcast, Under the Skin. We talked about many things. One of the things we discussed was civil war. Now, a lot of people have said, Tim, why do you think civil war is possible? Why do you think it's coming? Or outright said it's propaganda and it's BS. Well, the first thing I'll say is, when I take a look at The Atlantic arguing it's coming and Trump supporters will win, am I supposed to just be like, I'm smarter than everyone else and I will reject these things? No, I'm actually rather centrist and sometimes agree with the mainstream media and sometimes I don't. But regardless, there's more than enough ample evidence that there is a civil war looming. Sarah Silverman, a comedian, recently on her podcast argued for U.S. secession, that the United States should break apart into one or two or maybe one, two or three different countries. And she said, let the conservatives call themselves United States 1 and we'll be number 2 because they want to be number 1. But when you have people on the left saying the same thing as people on the right, peaceful divorce, the sentiment is there to break this country apart. According to data that we recently covered on this show, 37.2% of the U.S. population is in favor of their specific region breaking off from the U.S. into their own country. Conversations have been happening for some time about this. Now, it doesn't mean we reach that point and cross the Rubicon, as it were. But already, in New Hampshire, there has been a filing for secession. Apparently now 5 reps in New Hampshire are in support of New Hampshire seceding from the Union. What does all this mean? I think we are inching ever closer towards a complete and total collapse, at the very least. We don't know exactly what it will look like, but it really does seem like a fracturing of the country, some kind of balkanization, different regions becoming their own different countries, is increasingly likely. And while many people comment saying, yeah, well, China is excited by the news, perhaps I think they certainly are. And that's my biggest fear. If the U.S. does break apart, China just becomes the global dominant power, which is to say it's in their best interest to exacerbate the problems we're experiencing. But I've got a lot of articles to show you, a lot of bits of evidence to suggest I think the U.S. is at its wit's end. Now, of course, I have this Russell Brand YouTube just to highlight, that we talked about this. The fascinating thing here, in the comments section, I am simultaneously called a leftist and alt-right. Russell Brand's a celebrity. He's got fans all across the political spectrum, of course. And there are people calling me a leftist that are on the right, and there are people calling me alt-right that are on the left, showing you there is no center. You are either the left or the right. And if you don't agree with either that are gearing up for conflict, then you must be the other. Well, sounds like I'll have a good time in the event of any kind of real conflict, but I'm pretty sure I can take care of myself, at least to an extent that I would be okay, although not entirely happy. This is the article in question from The Atlantic. Will the U.S. pass a point of no return? My friends, August 13th, 2021. Very, very interesting writing. A civil war is coming. Trump supporters will win. Eventually, they'll lose power. But how long is eventually? So if you are on the left or the right, I think this is something that you should consider. And before we get started, I'll say this. Become a member at timcast.com if you support my work. You'll get access to exclusive members-only segments from the Timcast IRL podcast, but you'll be supporting our journalists as well. But most importantly, considering the weight of this reporting or of this opinion piece from The Atlantic and the allusions to history, share this video. You don't got to like me. You can be on the left or the right and call me left or right, say whatever you want. But consider the information I'm about to give you. When a mainstream publication says a civil war is coming, Sarah Silverman, of all people, advocates for U.S. balkanization. I think it's time to start considering maybe we're on that track, right? I don't know. I'd certainly think so, but I'm open to being wrong. But the more people pile on and say the same thing, the more I just say it's not about my opinion or making this stuff up. It's about watching everybody else getting ready. Here's the article from The Atlantic. Will the U.S. pass a point of no return? This is the latest installment in a series that began back in 2019 with an article I did for the print magazine on America's long-standing obsession with the decline and fall narrative of Rome. Many people wrote in to agree, disagree, or otherwise react. The online discussion begins here, and he goes on to mention the first installment. He says, Chapter 4, Crossing the Rubicon. Now, of course, this, if you're familiar with the history of ancient Rome, this is the point at which Caesar, they're like, yo, you can't bring your army past this point. And he was like, let's do it. And they crossed the Rubicon, the body of water, and that signified that he was basically saying the system is broke and I'm moving in. Schnurrer argues that this is more than just a familiar phrase. And he says that a U.S. Rubicon moment is in view, which would be triggered by a possible indictment of Donald Trump. Over to Eric Schnurrer. Crossing the Rubicon. If the United States in recent years has been tracking the decline and fall of the Republican Rome, when do we pass the point of no return? Now, for the bulk of the article, it is very long. I'm not going to read every little detail. He makes a bunch of really amazing points. Caesar, he says, Caesar, like most politicians, had committed his share of excesses and gained his share of enemies in his rise to the highest office in Rome, the consulship. But let's jump down to the important point. Will the Trumpist party similarly ultimately prevail once they cross the Rubicon? I have been predicting for years that something resembling a civil war will arise, and something like Trumpists likely will carry the day in the short term. But a reactionary philosophy that rejects fact in favor of fantasy is economically retrograde and socially repugnant to the majority of Americans, can impose its rule for only so long. Perhaps. And that's why civil war may not be the right answer. Well, I think it's interesting that this historian, academic, can take a look at ancient Rome and say Trump will cross the Rubicon and the supporters will likely win. He needs to understand the difference. Trump supporters don't want to own the federal government. In fact, they don't much like the federal government. They want to be left alone, which creates a very different circumstance. How will they lose power if they don't seek to rule over people they don't like? That, I think, would be interesting. In the end, you may actually just see a civil war. The country breaks apart, and now there are two different countries. And the Trumpists who seize the day say, we don't care what you do. Leave. Now, maybe it won't be so simple, especially when you realize you have resources to hold on to. But I think the more libertarian-minded and conservative individuals would prefer to be left alone. Here's where it gets really fascinating. He says some politician someday, one we don't yet know, whose thinking isn't locked into the current paradigm, will devise our own equivalent of the Augustinian settlement, a new consensus that both sides, today's red and blue Americas, can grudgingly accept because it purports to give them both what they want. We can suppose that, like Augustus. This new leader will need to satisfy conservatives by paying obeisance to traditionalist values and forms. But he or she will recognize the new economic realities shaping the future of wealth and power. Thus, perhaps, underneath the public facade of conservative rectitude, will flourish with tacit official approval a liberal urban society of tremendous innovation and wealth in science, technology, culture, art, thought, and belief generally. The problem with this article, when he says that the right don't believe in fact, but believe in fantasy, there are certainly arguments to be made that people on the right believe in fantasy. And I've certainly argued I think many of them are wrong, but this is not the majority of the right. It's not. You see, this man has fallen prey to the mainstream narratives. The right is not dominated by people who live in an alternative reality. In fact, when it comes to vaccine hesitation, there were two different studies, one showing PhDs to be the most likely to be hesitant, which would suggest PhDs typically being liberal. The liberals are more likely to disbelieve the narratives. And the other was that people with vaccine hesitancy were more well-versed on the scientific research and studies around the vaccines. In fact, many people cite the FDA insert on long-term effects as a reason for their hesitancy. This is not the party of ignoring facts. While there certainly are people on the right who do, and many of them, not the majority, and not with any institutional power. You need to understand that when you then see he thinks that urban society will generate wealth and science technology at a time when these jurisdictions are completely collapsing. But I don't completely disagree with him. Let's read on. He says, this is where it gets really, really fascinating. Will highly educated Americans really be willing to settle for physical security and financial success beyond anything now imaginable? When the crisis came, it was the optimates, i.e. the best people, who were the last defenders of the republic. Why? Because the status quo worked for them. Whereas the plebeians had long since lost faith in the system, the supporters of the republic were the cream of Roman society. Those who, as the saying went, had Greek, world-class educations, married amongst themselves and passed these advantages onto their children. The Republican structures they defended, elections, limited and dispersed powers, rule of law, in turn, supported the rest of the existing order. An increasingly globalized economy, exacerbating distributional divides, but benefiting their own class. Sound familiar? The optimates were tone deaf to the needs of those struggling to make a living, while the insurrectionists played to the working class in order to destroy what passed for democracy and impose their personal rule. Rich, out of touch, socially liberal Democrats versus rich, demagogic authoritarians masquerading as the party of the working class. Not far off from today. Actually, quite a bit far off from today. In your view, I would actually say this. Rich, out of touch, socially liberal Democrats who pretend to represent the working class, who provide no real solutions to the problems we face, and stripping power away from the working class, versus demagogic authoritarians masquerading as the party of the working class while sitting in Congress doing nothing but twiddling their thumbs. As in Rome, life is good for those who live in the hills and could save the republic. But the communities of the hinterland stretching off to the seemingly faraway Rubicon are increasingly devastated. Virtually all economic growth in the past decade has occurred in 3 coastal metros. Inequality has intensified. The opioid crisis has decimated countless communities of the interior. Increasingly illiberal progressives are slowly losing not just the white working class, but also black and Latino workers, those for whom they think and speak. They think they speak, and that's correct. Meanwhile, time grows short as aggrieved souls are forced from their dying communities and traditional social structures into a metropolitan economy that has no place for them. The army on the Rubicon draws closer every day to the city's walls. And remember, the army on the Rubicon are the Trump supporters in this analogy. And now I give you New Hampshire lawmakers consider proposal to secede from the United States. State Rep Mike Sylvia wants voters to consider the benefits of detaching from the federal government in 2022. If added to the 2022 ballot, it would read, quote, New Hampshire peaceably declares independence from the United States and immediately proceeds as a sovereign nation. All other references to the U.S. in this Constitution, state statutes, and regulations are nullified. Will it actually happen? Many people don't think so. They say it can't happen here. My friends, I think it can happen here. You need to understand something. The law, our political class and system matter nothing. Culture is everything. There are books you can buy about the wacky laws of the United States. You know, there's one where it's like in Massachusetts, you can't bake an apple pie on Sundays and put it on your windowsill. You think I'm kidding? There are laws where it's like in Rhode Island, showering on Tuesday is a imprisonable offense. And we're like, what? Those laws can't exist. They do. Not been repealed. And you see, the reason is there was a time where those laws made sense. You couldn't put the pies out because there was a large gathering at church and it attracted animals. Or you couldn't take a shower on Tuesdays because that was when, because there's a finite amount of water and they needed one day to dedicate towards farming or something like that. Today, we think it's ridiculous. And why aren't those laws being enforced? Because our culture shifted. because technology changed, because the laws themselves became irrelevant. But how can this be? We have laws on the books we just completely ignore? Yes. Well, that's what courts are for, right? Let me explain something to you. When the culture of this country drifts into the direction of balkanization or civil war, it will happen because the law doesn't matter. The military doesn't matter. Politicians don't matter. What matters is the confidence of the American people. Disney actor and comedian Sarah Silverman endorses secession of all people. Did you expect Sarah Silverman arguing that she doesn't want to be in a country with conservatives? So we should fracture the country in twain, as it were. Here's the story. The Wreck-It Ralph actress posted her endorsement to Twitter, preface it saying, maybe we should break up. Basically, she said, let me read. In the clip, she says, I mean, this may be a negative thought or maybe a positive one. I don't know. But if people aren't getting along like in a relationship, they break up, you know? So like, why don't we just finally just realize that these states aren't working and like divide up into like 2 or 3 countries? It'll be like USA 1 and USA 2. The comedian further stated, and they can be USA 1. Like the conservatives can be USA 1 because they love being number 1 and it means something to them. And I'd love to have that be theirs. They can be USA 1, we'll be USA 2, and we'll be allies. And you'll come over here and we'll go over there. And you know, when you come to many times when you go to a different country, you have to get a vaccine. That's that. You know what? What conservative is going to disagree with that? You want to have your New York state and do whatever you want? Fine, so be it. Give us Texas, West Virginia, Florida, South Dakota, whatever. I moved to West Virginia. We're continuing to expand our operations in West Virginia. Why? Because West Virginia's got a population of people who know what it means to be free and responsible for yourself. I don't want to live in New York where it's collectivist and a responsibility is ascribed to the government. Some people do. We cannot live in a country where representatives from Texas, from Texas, go to the federal government to advocate for their beliefs against a group of people from California who advocate for their beliefs that are so diametrically opposed. It makes no sense to put those laws over everyone else in the country. If the people of California want to force people to get vaccinated, well, I'll tell you what, that those people in California can leave. And if the people in Texas are angry that there is no mandate for vaccinations and people don't wear masks, those people can leave. At a certain point, we have to say the culture in this country has divided so far that it makes no sense for New Yorkers to ban my guns in West Virginia. None. Now, there are certainly civil rights issues that I think make tremendous sense that we have benefited from, which is the big problem. There was a civil war. Yes, slavery was wrong, and it was good that we ended it. And they tried, and the South tried to secede over this. So therein lies the big problem. What do you do? I think at a certain point, it's not about civil war. It's about balkanization and secession. That is to say, people are going to become more insular and say, my state's for me, your state's for you, and we're better off this way. It used to be that way. During the civil rights era, before Loving v. Virginia, many states said interracial marriage is okay. Many states said it's not okay. I think it's okay, and I think it should be for civil rights reasons and uphold the Constitution nationwide. I know the ramifications of what happens when you try to function in a country where half the country doesn't allow it, half does. My family knows this all too well. But I guess if the union dissolves or breaks apart, then you'll just have different countries. It won't be one nation anymore. If we are one nation under one constitution, I suppose it makes sense. We have to have federal law. But if the cultures have divided so much that there's no reconciliation at all and no willingness to fight a physical war over this, and we're not dealing with the repugnant moral atrocity of slavery, we're dealing with, I want to have guns and you don't, I think the country falls apart. The issue of slavery is interesting. It was so atrocious that foreigners came here seeking to end it. And I understand that completely. And when it comes to civil rights, segregation and racism, all of that, it's bad. So we said we are going to have a political conflict to end it. But now we're dealing with like taxes. Now we're dealing with vaccines. We're not dealing with apocalyptic scenarios. We're not dealing with slavery. We're dealing with, I want to be able to own guns on my farm. And the people in New York shouldn't pass a gun ban because I live on a farm. You live in a city. It's different. So what's really interesting about this is that we're supposed to have a weak federal government unifying the states, and the states were supposed to be their own thing. But the federal government has become has encroached so far, now people are like, break it apart. Silverman concluded the clip. By the end of the question, by the end of my answer, I have no idea what the question was. I don't think I'm anywhere near it. Yeah, I don't know. A lot of people are talking about it. They say secession has been tried in the past. Of course, I think people realize the Civil War existed. Let me tell you where we're at. Portland gunfight fuels alarm over growing use of weapons at rallies. Far-right Proud Boys regularly carry handguns, and other groups have adopted less lethal weapons. Oh, spare me. It was a leftist who shot that dude twice in the chest, the Trump supporter who died. This guy loves to write defense pieces for the left. And you know what? The right does show up with guns, but so does the left. And they do engage in shootouts. So how are you going to try and play this game? Portland Proud Boy Tiny Toes shot at Washington protest. Antifa fired wildly at Proud Boys, hitting one guy, Tiny, in the foot. He's lucky. This guy was randomly shooting in the streets. Not the first time. There's a video of a man driving his car when he gets blocked by Antifa and BLM protesters, and they aim rifles at him. He draws his gun on them. People are like, drop it, drop it. That's where we're at. It's going to get worse. And then on to New York City. Carmine's hostess attacked after asking tourists for vaccination proof to dine inside. The video's insane. We can't show it on YouTube because they don't allow you to show violence. It's a hostess. She's at a table. It's outside. And there were 3 women, and she asked them for proof of vaccination. An argument erupts, presumably because she didn't believe their proof was legit, and they start attacking her. This wasn't a case of unvaccinated people saying, we're going to hit you. It was people being denied, because apparently they did have vaccine proof that was being challenged. They say exclusive cell phone video obtained by NBC News shows the attack outside Carmine's restaurant. The 22-year-old hostess asked the group of Texans to show proof of getting the vaccine in order to dine, part of the executive order. Law enforcement sources said the hostess was then repeatedly punched in the face and body and sent to the hospital. In a statement, a spokesperson for Carmine said, "It's shocking and tragic when one of our valued employees is assaulted for doing their job, as required by city policies and trying to make a living." Since when were we a nation of rule by decree? I mean, it slowly happened. Gradually and then suddenly as it goes, right? Over a long period of time, decades, we've seen presidents use executive orders to rule by decree. Now, executive order makes sense. There are some things the executive branch has authority over. Notably, Joe Biden can mandate that federal employees get vaccinated because they work, the executive branch employees, but not the judiciary, not the legislature. Anybody who works for them are exempt from his order. If that's true, then, when Biden mandates all businesses, he has clearly bypassed legislation. He's ruling by decree. In New York City, that's what they're doing. Check this out. Confidence in the system is breaking apart. While we can see people fighting over this stuff, we can also see this. 11 of 15 restaurants not enforcing vaccine mandate. New York Post apparently had some undercover reporters go to various restaurants, and 11 of the 15 did not ask for proof of vaccination. In another story, a black family goes to a restaurant and is asked for proof of vaccination. They say they have a religious exemption. They're told no. They then point out that everyone else in the restaurant, the guy did not check any of their vaccine proof, went straight to the black family. And he says, "Is this the country you want to live in with segregation?" Some people said yes. Let me show you where we are going, my friends. Laura Loomer, you probably have heard of her, posted that she has COVID and she feels miserable and that she's been treated with monoclonal antibodies. Whatever your opinion is on Laura Loomer, she comes out and says she has COVID. And what do we see? Reza Aslan, formerly of CNN, says pray for COVID. That's right. Pray for COVID. COVID has infected Laura Loomer, and he's praying for the disease. The thing about what you need to understand there is, I can understand you. Okay, he doesn't like Laura Loomer, but if Loomer succumbs to COVID, other people are at risk too. Reza Aslan doesn't care. This man is evil. I don't use that word lightly, but I've been using it quite a bit lately. Why do I say evil? He's called for violence against children. He's now effectively calling for the death of Laura Loomer. I would not call for violence or death against Reza Aslan. You can see that we have some very evil people. Does the right have their evil people? They have a lot. But they've been excised from society, and they've never had strong institutional power to begin with. This is a multimillionaire who used to work for CNN. I said, at this point, divorce seems the only reasonable solution. When a married couple begins praying for the other to die, maybe it's time to just peacefully walk away. And how about this? The Mark Milley fiasco. The Daily Beast says, Milley's reported behavior constitutes a violation of both his legal authority and of norms. But the fact that I am still grappling with this ethical conundrum is indicative of how dangerous Trump's presidency was and continues to be. Barack Obama murdered an American child, and they did nothing. Barack Obama killed several Americans without charge or trial. To kill the son of Anwar al-Awlaki, Abdul Rahman, Obama ordered a drone strike on a civilian restaurant in Yemen. I wonder what the collateral damage was. There are reports that Donald Trump signed off on a commando raid that resulted in the death of Abdul Rahman's little sister, an 8-year-old American girl. That is bad. And you see, the issue is, I'm not in a cult. I can tell you right now, what Trump did was dangerous. But in the long run, Trump sought to end our excursions in the Middle East. However, he also provided weapons to Saudi Arabia, exacerbating the problems in Yemen. And I have no problem saying that. And I have no problem saying, you know what? That did make Trump dangerous, as every other president was dangerous. But why should I support the subversion of the U.S. military to China when they did nothing about Barack Obama? The point I'm making is not that Obama is worse, or Trump is better, or Trump is worse. It's that I recognize the problems of all of the presidents. And I'm sure you do too. I'm sure many of you would try and justify Obama's actions or Trump's actions or whatever. We got people on the left and the right. The fact of the matter is, when you have one faction that refused to acknowledge the extrajudicial assassinations of Barack Obama, and now they're acting like Trump was the dangerous one, these people live with blinders on. And for that, you can see there's no mending this divide. Let's keep talking about Mark Milley. Milley said the George Floyd riots were penny packet protests. They used spray paint. It's not an insurrection. The New York Post. Riots following George Floyd's death may cost up to $2 billion to insurance companies. You know what you need to understand about this? $2 billion to insurance companies means the total damages well exceed $2 billion. Mark Milley is woke. He says he wants to understand white rage. He says the George Floyd protests are penny packet protests, just spray paint. Don't worry about it. When over $2 billion in damages was accrued. When we saw like 30 deaths related to the riots. How do we solve this problem? Honestly, I don't have all the answers. Building culture, perhaps, or maybe peaceful divorce. The Hill says, right-wing extremism. History repeats itself, and the worst may be yet to come. You know what I find really, really fascinating about this? When they talk about the far right? I mentioned this in another segment, a previous segment. We had a guy on the IRL podcast, Super Chat, saying that I'm as delusional as the people I hate. That the left says the same thing I'm saying about them, about me. I'm objectively correct, though. And I think it's funny, so at the end, when I said we are objectively correct, everyone on the show laughs. Because the point is, if you're operating from the assumption that we're just falsely accusing each other, it's funny when there's two people in a fight and they both say, I'm right. No, I'm right. You're wrong. I'm right. Let me explain something to you. That's why I just showed you the article from the Daily Beast. Barack Obama murdered American citizens. It was horrifying. Donald Trump may have done the exact same thing with a commando raid as soon as he got into office. I've criticized both. I can criticize Donald Trump. I can criticize Joe Biden. And then I can look at the facts. I'm not going to pretend that progressives like Joe Biden. I can look at Russiagate, lies. I can look at Ukrainegate and see the evidence. Even Matt Taibbi, not a conservative, wrote an article about the various investigations into Burisma that Joe Biden ended by firing the prosecutor. And they say we're in the cult. No, I do fact checking every day. I read the news. I try and figure out what's going on to the best of my abilities and focus more on what the facts mean and freedom. But we have another group of people that is more obsessed with control, with wanting to tell you how to live your life. They say things like, we believe in science, but they don't even actually read any of the science. They've not read anything about the lab leak hypothesis, any of the studies or reports, but they claim to be the informed ones. Sorry, that's the cult. So if that's the case, will Trump supporters cross the Rubicon? Yes. That's why I don't know if they'll ever indict Trump. But what happens if Trump wins? If Trump wins in 2024, he's back. Maybe it'll be the left that crosses the Rubicon. And then we'll see. Next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.